Hey everybody, welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe. And as always, I'm ready to dive into some seriously juicy info with you all today. It's like we're mixing up a knowledge cocktail here. Strong stuff, but oh, so smooth going down.
And I'm Sunny, your friendly neighborhood fact checker. I'll make sure we get all the ingredients right. Speaking of mixing things up, you know what's always a good blend? Travel whiskey and discovering awesome new things. You have to check out our friend Mickey's YouTube channel, Mickey to Life.
Yeah, Mickey's the best. He's always got something cool going on.
All right, hey everybody, welcome back. Grabbing a drink, whatever you're sipping on, because we're kind of tackling a really big question today.
We do love those big questions.
You know how we get into those what does it all mean topics about culture and identity sometimes?
Absolutely. I mean, those are always so fascinating to kind of look at.
Like how things change, what sticks around, what gets lost.
Yeah.
This idea of traditional Chinese culture popped up. Where does it actually live and breathe today?
That is a huge question.
And massive, right?
Especially when you think about all the changes that have happened in China just in the last century. I mean, so many huge historical and political shifts.
We've touched on this before, like the Communist Party in mainland China with its Marxist-Leninist roots.
Right.
That feels like it really shook things up culturally.
Absolutely.
Almost like a new kind of cultural DNA got introduced. Maybe pushing this idea of struggle and, not always the most friendly way of interacting, shall we say.
Yeah. Well, with Marxist-Leninism at its core, you have this emphasis on class struggle.
Right.
And a very materialist view of the world.
Yeah.
Which is quite different from, say, traditional Confucian values that emphasize things like harmony.
Right.
And social order.
Right. And we even came across some opinions saying that certain behaviors, maybe, not so positive, sometimes get labeled as Chinese flaws.
Oh, wow.
Which, whoa, that's a heavy statement.
Yeah. It's definitely attributing behaviors to entire national traits.
Yeah.
Always a little tricky because it doesn't really take into account specific situations, historical, political, social circumstances.
So for you tuning in today, we're going to try to unpack this a little bit.
Okay.
We're diving into this idea of a supposed Chinese inferiority complex.
Yeah.
And whether those really beautiful traditional Chinese values, kindness, respect for elders, humility, are they still a thing in mainland China, or did they find a safer haven maybe somewhere else?
Yeah.
And specifically, we're going to look at Taiwan. Okay.
And if it might be holding on to something particularly authentic.
Yeah, I think looking at Taiwan is a great way to do this because it provides a really interesting contrast point to mainland China.
Right.
Especially after 1949.
Yeah, we've got some really interesting perspectives here going way back in history,
Yeah.
looking at what's happening today. So let's jump right in.
Let's go.
This whole idea of Chinese inferiority being a Western stereotype.
Yeah.
What's the story there?
Well, some people suggest that this idea of these inherent Chinese flaws might actually be a long-standing negative stereotype that comes from the West.
Okay.
If you think back to the 19th century, you have this concept of the yellow peril.
Oh, yeah.
This idea that China and East Asia in general are a threat to Western civilization.
I remember reading about that it was all tangled up with fears about immigration.
Oh, absolutely.
Economic competition.
Yeah.
Pretty nasty stuff.
Yeah, it was not good. And then fast forward to the 20th century, the Cold War.
Right.
Red Scare.
You get this whole other layer of negative imagery.
Right.
Associating China with the communist bloc, this ideological enemy.
Right. So it's not just this timeless truth about Chinese flaws.
Exactly.
It's really echoes of
It's baggage.
Yeah, historical
anxieties and biases that have been amplified over centuries.
Yeah.
So, you have to take a step back and think, is this really an accurate portrayal, or is this something that's been imposed from the outside?
Now, shifting gears a bit, it seems like this idea of national inferiority wasn't just coming from the outside. Some intellectuals within mainland China were actually using this concept to kind of critique their own society and culture, which is interesting.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see how this played out in different periods of Chinese history.
Okay.
So, for example, in the 1980s, you have this period of modernization, opening up to the West. A lot of intellectuals are looking at their own society and being very critical of traditional aspects, seeing them as holding China back.
And it sounds like this kept going into the late 20th and early 21st century.
Yeah, that's right. And what's really fascinating is that these reformist and liberal intellectuals sometimes ended up, according to one of our sources, being used to really denigrate Chinese history and culture in a very sweeping way, almost blaming everything except the Communist Party for China's problems.
Oh, wow.
So you get this kind of extreme viewpoint where it's like heaven is bad, earth is bad, the mountains are bad, the rivers are bad, the people are bad, history is bad, culture is bad, but the Communist Party is never bad.
That's almost like a cartoon.
Yeah, and that's a direct quote from one of our sources.
Wow.
Kind of highlight how extreme it got.
Okay.
And people are arguing that this is a form of what they call national nihilism.
So the argument is that this is actually a result of the suppression of Chinese history and traditional culture.
Right. The argument is that this is a twisted outcome of decades of the Communist Party.
Right.
Basically denying and undermining traditional Chinese culture and values.
Right.
So instead of confronting the real issues, you get this kind of scapegoating of everything else.
Interesting.
To protect the image of the party.
Okay, so this brings us to this point about the CCP's party culture versus traditional Chinese culture. Because a lot of these negative behaviors that people point to might actually be linked to this party culture.
Exactly.
Rather than something inherently Chinese.
That's a key distinction.
So what do we mean by party culture?
Well, by party culture, we're talking about the specific set of values, beliefs, and behaviors that are promoted and enforced by the Chinese Communist Party.
Okay.
It's very much rooted in Marxist-Leninist ideology.
Right.
It emphasizes things like loyalty to the party above all else. And so the argument is that these negative behaviors we see are more a result of this imposed party culture than something intrinsic to Chinese culture itself.
And it makes sense when you think about it.
Right.
Marxist-Leninism, with its focus on class struggle, absolute authority of the party. That's a totally different game from Confucianism with its emphasis on harmony.
Right. Completely different philosophical foundations.
Social hierarchy based on respect and merit. And the importance of traditions and rituals.
Yeah, and this is a big point that our sources make, is that Marxist-Leninism has actually caused a lot of harm to Chinese society, both spiritually and materially. So this whole promotion of class struggle, the idea that you have to have these social divisions and conflict, that's really damaging to the social fabric. Then this insistence on the party's absolute leadership, that can have real consequences.
What are some examples of what this party culture looks like in everyday life?
Yeah, so our sources have some pretty stark examples. One of them is, young students being encouraged to criticize and even denounce each other for minor things, like, getting a little red flower. It creates this atmosphere of suspicion and competition from a very young age. Another example is, this tendency to write very insincere and formulaic things in school essays. Prioritizing political correctness over genuine expression. So you can imagine how that kind of environment could shape a person's view of the world.
That's pretty unsettling to think about, turning kids against each other like that.
Yeah, it's a very different picture from the kindness and respect we were talking about earlier.
It doesn't seem very kind or respectful.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that these types of behaviors aren't really seen in other societies that have been influenced by Confucianism. So you look at Korea, Japan, they have their own unique cultures, but they also have this shared emphasis on social harmony, respect for elders.
Which comes from that Confucian influence.
Exactly.
Interesting.
But our sources also point out that, similar patterns were seen in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe under communist regimes. So this suggests that it's really this Marxist-Leninist ideology, this party culture, that's the driving force behind these negative behaviors, not some kind of inherent Chinese trait.
Okay, so if mainland China has been so shaped by this party culture, what about Taiwan? Our question was, is it a haven for a more authentic Chinese culture and values?
Well, the historical context is key here. Because when the nationalist government fled to Taiwan in 1949, they brought with them all these cultural elites, artifacts. I mean, a big part of what's now in the National Palace Museum came over during that time. And they also continued the education system of the Republic of China. Which was much more rooted in these Confucian traditions. So in a way, it was like a snapshot of pre-communist China got preserved in Taiwan.
So Taiwan didn't go through the same upheavals after the revolution, so they were able to kind of hold on to more of that traditional culture.
Exactly. And one of the key things is that Taiwan didn't experience the Cultural Revolution,
Right.
which had a devastating impact on mainland China.
Yeah.
You know, traditional festivals like the Confucius ceremony were able to continue in Taiwan.
Right.
The use of traditional Chinese characters, folk beliefs,
Right.
all these things were able to survive and even flourish in Taiwan.
While on the mainland, they switched to simplified characters.
Exactly.
And there was this real push for atheism. So it's a huge difference just in the written language alone.
It is a huge difference because even the characters themselves
Right.
carry so much cultural meaning
Yeah.
and history. But beyond that, Taiwanese society still places a high value on things like filial piety, this deep respect for your parents and elders.
Right.
And, you know, social etiquette is still really important. So you have this blending of traditional values with modern democratic values.
Right.
And events like the Confucius ceremony still attract a lot of attention in Taiwan,
Interesting.
which shows that these traditions are still relevant
Right.
to modern society.
And because of this, Taiwan often sees itself as the legitimate inheritor of Chinese culture,
Yeah, absolutely.
especially going back to the Cold War when it was positioned as the free China
Exactly.
in opposition to communist New China. So there's this real sense of being the true torchbearer
Yeah.
of Chinese culture.
Especially during that period.
Okay, so we've laid out these arguments for Taiwan being a real stronghold of traditional Chinese culture. But is that authenticity exclusive to Taiwan?
That's a good question.
Is it really the only place where these values have survived?
Well, it's a complex issue.
Yeah.
And I think the argument that it's only in Taiwan is a bit too simplistic.
Okay.
First of all, Chinese culture is incredibly diverse.
Right.
Even in mainland China.
Right.
You still have these pockets of traditional values, you know, especially in rural communities
Right.
or within specific folk traditions.
Yeah.
It's not like Marxism completely wiped everything out.
Yeah.
And then you have overseas Chinese communities
Well, yeah.
all around the world
Yeah.
who have been practicing and transmitting
Yeah.
different aspects of Chinese culture for centuries.
Right. It's global.
So it's not like Taiwan is the sole inheritor.
Right. It's not like this one little island holds the keys to everything.
Right? Exactly.
Right.
Another thing to consider is that Taiwan itself has changed a lot. You know, they went through a period of Japanese colonization.
Right.
And then there's been the influence of Western democracy.
Right.
So their culture has integrated new elements. It's not some purely orthodox form of ancient Chinese culture.
Right.
Like take marriage equality, for example.
Right.
That's a very modern value.
Yeah.
But it might not necessarily align perfectly with traditional Confucian views on family and marriage.
Right.
So it's about understanding how cultures evolve
Right.
and adapt.
Interesting.
And then another point is that mainland China is actually seeing some efforts to revive traditional culture.
Yeah.
You know, you have the Hanfu movement where people are wearing traditional Han Chinese clothing.
Oh, yeah. I've seen pictures of that.
And there's this renewed interest in Confucianism.
Okay.
So it's not like it's completely gone.
Right.
It's more like it's being reinterpreted and reshaped.
Right. It's being filtered through the current political situation.
Exactly.
Before we keep going,
Yeah.
I want to give a shout out to our friend Mickey.
Yes.
You guys have got to check out his YouTube channel, Mickey to Life.
It is so good.
Seriously, the guy's got some incredible travel vlogs.
I love his travel vlogs.
The kind that make you want to book a ticket right now.
Mm-hmm.
Hilarious whiskey and alcohol unboxings.
Oh, he knows his stuff.
The man knows his spirits, trust me.
Yeah,
And he shares his original music.
he does.
Super talented dude.
Very talented.
Actually, his travel vlogs inspired a trip I took a while back.
Definitely.
So yeah, go check him out, Mickey to Life on YouTube.
Yeah, regret it.
You won't regret it.
Okay, back to our deep dive.
Back to our deep dive. So we've looked at the historical context.
Mm-hmm.
Different paths mainland China and Taiwan have taken.
Yeah.
But to bring this down to a more personal level, I think it would be interesting to hear some of our own experiences. Even just little observations about cultural differences we've noticed. Like,
Yeah.
I remember mention a country that is not China or Taiwan, and I had this interaction with someone who was of Chinese heritage, but had grown up there. I asked this question. I thought it was pretty straightforward, maybe a little direct.
Yeah.
And they seemed taken aback, almost like I had been rude.
Interesting.
It made me realize how different cultures have different norms around communication.
Right.
And what I consider normal might be perceived totally differently in their cultural context. I'm not saying it's a flaw or anything, just a different way of interacting.
Yeah, it's just about understanding those differences.
And it made me think about the respect aspect of those traditional values.
Absolutely.
Like how that plays out in different ways.
It's so interesting how even something like communication style can be influenced by cultural norms.
Yeah.
And these deeper ideas about politeness and social etiquette, which are really central to Confucianism. You know, it's not about judging.
Right.
It's about understanding and appreciating those different perspectives.
Right.
And how they shape the way we interact with each other.
And I had this opposite experience in Taiwan.
Oh.
I was struck by how incredibly helpful and considerate people were.
Oh, wow.
I was totally lost trying to find this tea shop.
Okay.
And this older woman literally walked me several blocks out of her way.
Wow.
Just to make sure I found it.
That's amazing.
It was so genuinely totally unexpected.
Yeah.
And it really made me think about those traditional virtues. Gentleness, kindness, respect, frugality, humility.
Yeah, it sounds like you saw them in action.
It felt like it, yeah.
Yeah, and that fits with what we were talking about earlier with Taiwan.
Yeah.
And how those Confucian ideals are still very present in everyday life.
Right.
It's often in those small gestures that you really see a culture's values shine through.
Makes you wonder if those little differences we notice in everyday interactions have more to do with the bigger cultural influences.
Right.
Whether it's that party culture in mainland China or those more traditional values in Taiwan.
Exactly.
Than with some kind of inherent national characteristic.
It's about looking at the bigger picture.
Right.
Understanding the context, the history that shapes these different societies.
So as we wrap up this deep dive for you, this idea of a simple good China versus bad China when it comes to cultural values.
Right.
Way too simplistic.
Way too simplistic.
More complex than that.
It's about recognizing the nuances, the complexities.
And this whole idea of Chinese flaws probably has some pretty problematic roots.
Yeah, we have to be critical of those kinds of generalizations.
In Western biases, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And while national inferiority has been used for self-critique in mainland China, a lot of the behaviors we see might be more about that party culture, the Marxist-Leninist foundations.
Right. It's not about inherent flaws.
Than some ancient tradition.
It's about understanding the impact of systems, ideologies, historical events.
And Taiwan definitely stands out as a place where a lot of those beautiful traditional Chinese values and practices have continued.
Yeah, it's a unique case.
Relatively untouched by those big ideological shifts.
Absolutely.
It's kind of like a living link to the past.
It offers a fascinating perspective.
But to say it's only in Taiwan, that feels a little too definitive.
I agree.
Because culture is alive.
It's dynamic.
It's breathing. It evolves in different ways in different places. Plus, people in mainland China and all over the world are still connected to aspects of Chinese culture, even if it's adapted or reinterpreted.
Culture transcends borders.
Right.
It's constantly evolving and being reshaped.
So maybe the real question isn't where the most authentic culture exists, but how can those core values of kindness and respect thrive and adapt in all these different contexts, no matter the political system or the historical baggage.
That's the real challenge.
What do you think it takes to keep those values alive and flourishing?
I think it takes a willingness to engage in open dialogue.
Okay.
To understand and appreciate our different heritages without idealizing them.
Right.
And to really prioritize these universal human values in our everyday lives.
Something to think about.
Yeah.
Thanks for diving deep with us today on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for being here.
Always love hearing your thoughts, so feel free to connect with us.
Yeah.
Let us know what you think.
Let us know.
Until next time.
See you then.